Thank you very much, Fiona. And I think everyone who was able to see the concert of Siobhan's piece would want to congratulate her on such an incredible piece of music and a particularly intensive piece of music, which, yeah, strikes home really quite intensely on many, many different things. So, yeah, it was quite the experience across the board for everyone. So, for those who may need it, I am wearing headphones. I've got a nice, lovely beard. We've got a lovely white wall behind me, and you can see hints of my keyboard, which has various bits of music on it. And I'm wearing a black t shirt. So, with the title Autistic Music, where does an autistic composer fit in, past and present? We first face the difficulty of discussing music history, in the sense of when discussing a minority or an oppressed group, we risk either sort of extrapolating our own current vision on the past, which means either we sort of miss bits because we don't understand the circumstances properly in the past, or we sort of accidentally include individuals in a manner that we didn't necessarily fit them to that period of time. And arguably, when discussing disability, especially mental learning disabilities, this becomes even more complex because of various different reasons on top of it. So, to give a bit of background before we can understand the music, we have to sort of look at how autism and neurodivergence has evolved as a thing. So, Roy Porter's Madness, A Brief History, it highlights how many mental disorders or illnesses or disabilities have existed as long as humanity has, and has played a curious but changing role within society and culture. As part of that, autism has had quite a curious history of its own, not least in part because it's continually developed and changed, partly because of our understanding of it, but also because of its relation to society in different ways. So firstly, prior to the 1940s, autism was seen as a variant of schizophrenia. However, there is sort of discussions of a Sukareva syndrome, which was based on the discoveries of the Soviet psychiatrist of the same name. And she was arguably the first to separate it from schizophrenia, but it didn't go much further than that in sort of exploration. But we then sort of see as a point of quite intense controversy, there was either in 1943, Leo Kanner made the separation of autism as a separate diagnosis of its own thing, or there was Hans Asperger in 1944, where he defined autism as a separate thing apart from the Asperger syndrome that he also had discovered. So without wanting to spend too much time on the particular controversy around Hans Asperger, it needs to sort of be noted that the controversy is based on sort of 2 points. One, in the question of who actually discovered it first. Was it Leo Kanner? Was it Hans Asperger? But the second issue is with Hans Asperger's recently discovered Nazi sympathies. It was highlighted that the separation of Asperger's and autism was used as a way to separate between the useful idiot and the useless eaters, who were obviously then went on to be murdered as part of the Action T via system by the Nazis. And so that has caused quite a lot of, obviously it's quite unsettling in various different forms for various parts of the community because of the connotations of what a mental and physical condition has. So that in itself is a curious start in itself, but then we move forward into the future. In 2013, another major shift happened, thankfully not as controversial, but the DSM saw that there was not enough to separate Asperger's and autism, which then meant that they were both brought into one singular banner, being autism, used to describe them both. So, for example, when I was younger, I was diagnosed with both autism and Asperger's, whereas now I would only be diagnosed with autism. And so when we have these small changes that have happened medically, we then also see that culturally that then has a curious response alongside it. So for a long time, autism was seen as a childhood disorder, which meant that the pressure for accommodations was led primarily by concerned parents, because that's who needed the support, that's where the emphasis was. And even though that is a very important thing to do, obviously kids need as much access to education and support as they need. The problem with that kind of dynamic is the agency isn't with the autistic individual. And so what we then found, particularly when Temple Grandin started to become a household name, it slowly became sensible or sort of understood that autism is something that stays with us once we turn 18. And so because of that slowly maneuvering sort of understanding, it then meant that the shift for activism, both sort of socially, culturally, and on for various different fronts, became much more of an autistic-led thing. And so this then led to the creation of groups like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which we see in the United States. And then also, this is when we started to see the invention of the term neurodivergency, because that became one as a way of understanding autism within the social model of disability, which is the understanding that the prior problems of disability are in the way that society is constructed, not necessarily in the individual who is disabled. And so what neurodiversity, was able to do was to be able to bring autism, Asperger's, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other similar conditions into one particular banner, which then meant that it could then create sort of a realm for activism, for support, and for community, which, if people are sort of interested in that kind of element, I would highlight the wonderful socio-cultural history book, Neurotribes, which is written by Steve Silberman, who was, the name of the book is quite an obvious inspiration for today's conference. So when we have that understanding that autism has sort of evolved and neurodiversity has come onto the scene, we can then start to see how the difficulties we have when discussing the musical history. One, because retrospectively we can't really diagnose individuals, and secondly, we're not just something that's just magically appeared thanks to the MMR vaccine. We are something that's been deeply entwined with human history, despite us knowing that we're there at all. However, even though I've been sort of arguing that we don't want to retroactively diagnose people, one exception really can be made for Eric Satie. If one looks at his essay, A Day in the Life of a Musician, we see a really honest insight into his daily life, and he describes how he regulates his day into very, very exact minutes. So he is inspired between the times of 10:23 and 11:47 exactly. He also describes eating only white food, such as rice or egg whites, and how he's always very controlling of his breathing, never wanting to breathe too deeply, lest it creates a panic, but just calm enough and light enough that he feels is comfortable. And so for a long period of time, people have documented Satie's eccentricities. However, when you sort of look at that, but also with the understanding of what neurodivergency is, it's quite obvious to sort of think that Satie was wired differently, like the rest of us neurodivergents. And so with this sort of understanding, I wouldn't necessarily suggest people go back and reevaluate Satie. One, because in the sense of his music's wonderful, it's stood the test of time, and it's a really magnificent music across the board. And I feel that if we tried to look at how autistic it is, we'd sort of reevaluate it wrong, or at least try to create a disingenuous link of something like the repetitive ideas of because he likes repetitive habits or silly things like that, and not actually just enjoy the music for what it is. But it's also the problem, if we go backwards in that kind of way as well, is the understanding that had Satie had been diagnosed at the time, his ability to become a composer would have inevitably disappeared the day he was diagnosed. And so when it comes to sort of looking historically, we have to sort of see that autism can be found everywhere, but it is stuck within the limitations of the society surrounding it. But what the example of Satie also demonstrates is there's a clear reason why autistic composers in general are starting to appear much more now currently, because the material circumstances around us has allowed us to actually prop up. We're in a position where in the space of 20 years, in the space of 30 years, autism has been seen as a very normal thing that happens in adults as well as in children. And so then this has meant that the ability to be an autistic composer has finally started to come into being because we are adults, we enjoy music, we enjoy other things. And so we are finally here. So it's not to be misunderstood as sort of some trend that's appeared out of nowhere, but it has only managed to happen now because of the various different developments in human history that has allowed this to happen. And so as a result of this society coming to terms with autistic adults, we're able to sort of see the culture that's coming with it, much like we saw within the Harlem Renaissance, how all communities naturally have their own creative voice. They just need the means and the opportunity to be able to explore what that voice is, in short. And so, as we were able to see from the composers presenting at the conference today, this musical renaissance is full of a great musical energy, and it's truly quite impressive, even just from the point of view of what I could have expected just 10 years ago when I started my studies in comparison to now is huge, to say the least. But if we look at the composers like Jason Hodgson, where we see a composer exploring the limits of aleatory as well as other fantastical experimentations that is happening within their work. In Siobhan Dyson and Joe Stollery, there is a huge exploration of various routes on native and local themes amongst various other different parts. So, for example, Siobhan Dyson's wonderful The 45 for wind orchestra is a really fascinating work exploring various bits of Scottish history. We also have Joe Scollery's Skene Obsession, which we will get to hear later today, which looks at the legend of the Laird of Skene, who was an accused wizard who, at a local ceilidh, forced the dancers to dance themselves to death. In Ryland Gleaves, we see a composer eager to engage with a huge variety of concerns, both personal and impactful of society at large, which is always truly very meaningful and not just trying to kick the bucket over, but just is there and with real content and intensity to actually engage with those social issues in question. We also have the music of Benjamin Teague, which we will get to hear in the concert later today, and they've very much followed their similar teacher Peter Reynolds, where there's this brilliant ability to make miniature things speak volumes louder than you'd imagine from something so, and it's truly a wonderful thing, and it's quite wonderful that we were able to include Benjamin Teague's music in there as well today. Other composers of note who are able to present today or have their music involved today is Oliver Cross and Antoine Ouliette. Oliver Cross, a player and composer who explores lots of folk traditions as well as combining them with electronics, and he's also done lots of various other different kind of music with Drake Music, with Dada Fest, and he is a really wonderful fellow, and I'd recommend people explore him. And then with Antoine Ouliette, is a French-Canadian composer who's very much like his book, Musique Autiste, which just is wonderful self-reflection and pondering on what it means to be him. And the book as well, I'd also recommend reading, just because it is someone who's died at 35, and so he then looked back at were there hints of that autisticness in his music earlier, and so he's talking about how his preference for consonant harmonies, more simple forms, is just because of that familiarity and other bits, and so he sort of pins it down to that autistic. But these being said, all these wonderful examples, it's only going to be a small amount of them, and the reality is there's going to be about. We either just haven't found them, or they've yet to come to the forefront, or yet had the opportunity to do the wonderful music we'll likely hear. So it's, even though it's a very small community currently, it is one that is going to keep growing in various different forms. So bring the talk to a close. This conference will demonstrate there's a huge variety and curiosity in the music in our featured composers, but we can also be moving forward from this conference as we have the ability, like with other disabled composers, the community is growing, And so whatever's going to happen, the community is going to grow. However, the question is, are we going to allow this community to grow through a determined, because the composers are just very stubborn and don't want to do anything else beyond compose? Or are we going to help create a circumstance where they have an environment to allow them to grow, which is quite a huge difference. So either between composers fighting to be heard or being allowed to thrive. That is what I hope we can sort of consider moving forward. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.